Hey, hi, this is Editor-in-Chief Dorothy Chan. Today, our lovely intern, the wonderful Asia St. Germain, and I have the pleasure and honor of interviewing the multi-talented, beautiful poet, writer, editor, creator, I.S. Jones on her chapbook with Newfound. Shout out to Newfound, Spells of My Name. First of all, check out this very gorgeous cover and back cover. We'll be talking much more in detail today on Sticky Fingers. Jones is a previous Honey contributor, and her poetry and writing always has a home at our hive. So, Etiola, anytime, we're always happy to promote your work. And her two poems, Next One On and Kitchen Work, are featured in issue one, our debut issue. And now we even have a new website. So go check them out yet again. We're always happy, once again, to be working with Etiola. Always a pleasure. The Hive is your biggest fan, and we wanted to send love to you via this long distance Zoom call today. And in addition, Next One On, one of the poems I just cited from Honey, is also part of this book, Spells of My Name. So please welcome I.S. Jones. And Asia and I have prepared some, I think, really thought-provoking, important questions today. I'll pass it over to you now, Asia, to start.
So we really wanted to start with the historical. So whether that's a world historical lens or the personal as historical. When we were discussing your chapbook, we discussed how studying literature and history really goes hand in hand, both as citizens of our country or citizens of the world to better understand and enact a deep historical change. That deep historical knowledge is absolutely crucial. So, history in your collection also works on a personal and intimate level. It intersects with matrilineage and the study of queer Black feminism. Can we please start talking about these intersections of historical study and illusion, as well as creative writing and poetry, and how it intersects with the historical?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Asia. In the first iteration of the chapbook, that was a crucial cornerstone of the book that was missing, right? When I first finished the chapbook, I sent it out to a bunch of places. It wasn't working. So I scrapped the chapbook and I kind of rebuilt it again from scratch, right? I had an idea of the series of interviews with the American Nigerian that guide one of the few cycles that guides the movement of the chapbook. There's a poem, one of the erasures. It begins one of the lines in one of the American Nigerian poems just goes something like, "History never had the ambition to account for people like me," something like that, right? I think all the time about how the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War, forever changed the trajectory of my family, right? Um, I believe, or at least I want to believe, had that war not happened, I might have still been born. I might have been born in Nigeria as a Nigerian woman with Nigerian sensibilities. And I think often about how I said in the last of the four erasures, violence and hope made me an American, right? I think I forever have to reconcile with the fact that my Americanness is forever tied into both of those things, right? Um, in a lot of ways, the chapel kind of felt like I was dipping my toes into the personal as history, right? My mother being jumped and left for dead by guerrilla soldiers, my father's very arduous journey towards naturalization, me even reclaiming my name and like what that means, right? Um, to have my name is also to hold my grandmother's name and her grandmother's name and so on and so forth, right? In a lot of ways, my name is for a long time I felt this way that my name was like the only thing about my Nigerian heritage that I could hold on to. And, now that I've moved through the world a bit more and made more colleagues and I feel more comfortable in my identity than I did when the chapbook came out, I know that that's not necessarily true. I think in a lot of ways the story of history is also the story of the personal, right? They say that history is told by the winners. I mean, I said history is told by the colonizers, right? But I think that it was really important for me to write these poems about the personalized history because I was scared to at first. I didn't want to. I wanted to write all these beautiful, elaborate poems that like have a beautiful outlaw and do all these weird things with form, which is fine and fun. But I realized that I was using that to hide from the really difficult poems, right, which were the ones about me and my father, and how at the center of the chapbook, that's what the poems are trying to get at, right? This sort of fraught relationship with both of us, and whether I'm running from or running towards something.
I really love what you just said right there, Etola, whether you're running from or running towards something, and how you were also talking about your process just now, in that obviously there are many ways in the world to exist as a poet. And of course, one of those ways is that we can be extremely experimental and create extremely elegant and innovative forms that also, let's say, push back against this white canon that is shoved down our throats since the start of our education. But I do really admire the very core of what you just said as well, this confrontation of what was I most afraid of or dreading to write about, and really getting there. So you just saying that that consists of the heart, the middle section, what I would like to call the chapbook or the collection's volta, I think is very remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Thank you for that, Dorothy. And then in the original iteration of Spells, the last poem was my therapist asked, is the hunter in your dreams your father?
Yep.
And that was the poem that made me realize, oh no, this chapbook is about me and my dad. I can't escape now that I see it. I really did not want to write poems about me and my father at all. I did not. But all of the poems, the poems were smarter than me and kept saying, when I got to the Volta, they were like, oh, surprise, this is actually about you and your father. It was that poem and also Queer American. I was with Clear American. I tasked myself with writing a series of lines. It's written. Is it written in mono
Yep.
stitches? I haven't seen the book in a long time, so I don't remember. But I think it's written in a series of mono stitches where they're declarative sentences, all end stop but periods. And then when I got to the turn, I realized, oh, all of these things, all of these conceits that I was making was really me trying to hide from what the poem really wanted to talk about, which was this fraught relationship with my father. And I think once I stopped hiding from that, the book clicked into place. And then I wrote two or three more poems that ended the book. So then the proper ending, which felt like the right ending, How to Spell Infinity, I think really got at what the chapbook wanted to end with. Not so much me winning over my father or defeating him, but being free of that violence, or setting myself free of that pain and violence despite what has happened, right? But I think also something that's important, at least just for me myself, the person, not so much me myself, the poet, is that so much of this chapbook was me trying to make language around my father's suffering, right, and around his pain, and humanize him in ways that I did not know how to before, especially with the poem on transatlantic shame, that long poem towards the end. Uh, I wrote that poem. I wrote that poem probably like a year before I realized I was writing a chapbook, right?
Mhm.
And then I realized, oh wait, all of these poems are speaking to each other, and this is the long piece that wants to move through the book. And I think in a lot of ways it gave me peace and allowed me to forgive my father in ways that I might not have been able to. Because I'm not interested in painting him to be a monster. I'm not interested in
Mhm.
saying this is the things that he did to me, and I want everyone to know. That's not really interesting writing to me. Like therapy. You can go to therapy; it's always an option, right? But I think that I was really interested in a gesture of compassion, trying to understand what made him the way he is and how he carried his wounds into fatherhood, and I inherited those wounds. And then how do I my healing began with kind of going back in time, which is what transatlantic shame is doing, right? Pressing the fast forward button and going through 20 years of my father's life. Yes, 20 years, 15, 20 years of his life until he came here to the States and until I was born. Um, yeah, that was a long, long-winded response to what you said, but
No, I love that too because you, in especially I think of Queer American to me is one of the such the major standout of this chapbook. It is a poem that I like to teach. It is a poem where like when I'm like reading the first two lines aloud, like I just start laughing because like it's what Lyra Van Cleef Stefan calls truth with a capital T in poetry. I mean, do you get better than two opening lines that start with I have sex with men but make love to women? There is nothing better than that. And that is all yours. And thank you. And then following that up with I only wish to fuck men who are also desire to be fucked by men. But going back to your father, the way that we finally land in this poem, the way that we finally end with he knows nothing about me. There are things we are too embarrassed to say. I think, for lack of a better word, and also connecting these observations to on transatlantic shame, is this idea of how everything in this chapbook is also named. And through the release, we also get that power. And also through this nuance and complexity and naming the violence, we also, the speaker, I should say, excuse me, the speaker brings out that power too. And it is not to shame the father figure, but bring on like a greater understanding of what is inherited and then what ends up being rejected, and maybe something else, something much more powerful and feminist and beautiful becomes like rejuvenated. And that is like what rises. I also wanted to now bring attention to one of the poems in Honey Literary issue one, and having you, Etiola, as part of that debut when our magazine was just starting out was just like the greatest honor. I still remember the day when Rita had told me that you were in her inbox, and like we really just like celebrated, you know, because when we were creating this journal, your work and your presence in the literary world was one of the inspirations as well. So I want to draw attention now to Nexplanon, which we talked about this, Asia, but Nexplanon really exemplifies why a space like Honey Literary exists, period. And one of the reasons why I think it's like the ideal poem for Honey Literary, which to the audience members who are watching now who don't know, Honey Literary is a BIPOC focused lit mag, and it is run, founded by all women, queer femmes of color. And within this poem, speaking of, let's say, queerness,
Mhm.
I underlined the words virginity, boyfriend, and the combo tribe of girlhood. These combinations really like intrigued us as a hive. And they're a satirical contemplation of the self once engrossed by heteronormative ideals and expectations. So I guess what I'm trying to say here too, it's like a study of like a tone within a poem. And Honey's motto by, once again, the great Lyra Van Cleef Stefanen is in writing, we want to F or fuck with the ineffable. Could you talk a bit more, Itiola, about like why words such as like, or how you use words like virginity and boyfriend, and how the usage of those words in combo speaks to effing with the ineffable?
Yeah, yeah. What a beautiful question. I wanted to say first, real quick, before I forget, the poem Queer American is indebted to Nicole Seeley, like very much so indebted to her. I just want to say it on the record. So with Nexplanon, it really means a lot what you said about how Nexplanon exemplifies what Honey Literary is doing, because when I wrote it, I was just going to let it live in the chapbook. I was never ever going to publish Nexplanon because it was such a very deeply intimate poem to me, because I never really talked so publicly about my birth control, right? Um, and when I finished the poem, I just decided I'm going to tuck it very quietly in the chapbook. No one is ever going to see it unless you get the chapbook, right? But then when I saw Honey Literary and I saw y'all's mission statement, I was like, wow, my little poem has found a home. This is great. Like when I imagined I had no intention of ever publishing until Honey Literary existed. Then I said, there's no other magazine I could think of that would have such a home that is so deserving of it than this magazine. So it means a lot that like you also, yeah, like I just warmed my heart. When I wrote Nexplanon, I was getting my birth control replaced for the third time. And if you all know anything about the birth control, it lasts 3 years. And it can have very adverse effects on AFAB people because it'll either stop your menstruating altogether, or you'll like menstruate for 6 months straight, like I did, and then stop for like 2.5 years, right? And I really love the idea that I could control my own menstruation. As someone who's also kind of negotiating a lot of dysphoria around menstruation, that was really nice. And I was still trying to find language around my sexuality as well. I knew that I was, how you say, done with men.
That's always the greatest phase, isn't it?
But I knew that I still wanted the protection. And when I said, and in the poem, I said I wanted what any woman wants: protection and pleasure. I sought out a savior adorned in white. I said I meant pleasure as in sex though, but I also meant pleasure as in I could do with my body what I wanted, right? Some poet had said something about like there's some pleasures you keep for yourself in the poem, and that's an example of one of the pleasures I keep for myself. To F the ineffable. Hmm. I don't know. I mean, like, I'm sure there are other poems about birth control, but I don't know if I've ever read any that encompass girlhood and sort of the soft and quiet language of girlhood about what it means to lose your virginity. Because I remember when I first did the deed, I was excited because I had some sort of social currency to trade with other girls. Like I had new
Hmm.
stories to tell, right? I didn't care so much about the person who I lost it to. I was like, all right, whatever, whatever. I just wanted the story. I didn't care so much. And then later when I got older, I was like, oh, that was kind of a weird way I looked at it. But I think it was but I think even at like 17, I think it was really fascinating that I cared more about what my girlfriends thought about my losing my virginity and how I would now be perceived than so much the actual act of it itself, right? And I'm glad that I wrote this poem when I was older and I had a bit more clarity. Um, so it was that, right? And then also some questions towards the end come up. Do you want children someday? How long have you been on this birth control? When was your last period, right? Um, it was really important for me to have these moments of reflection throughout. I mean, the entire poem is about reflecting back, right? About childhood and pleasure and how I equated girlhood with pain, right? I equated like the space between girlhood and womanhood with pain and something about the body shedding something of itself, right? Um, what was the other part of the question, Dorothy? Sorry.
I think it was also like kind of looking specifically at words such as like
Oh,
girlhood and virginity, because something that you were also kind of alluding to just now, Etiola, was about how to you at that age, much younger, that was a form of social currency. So there was an act, let's say, between you and this other person, but you
yeah,
didn't care as much about or care at all about that the act itself, but more of like what social currency it brings, which I find really fascinating because I think that that also sheds so much light into how virginity itself is such like it is just this is this heteronormative concept, but more importantly, it is also this social construct as well.
yeah. I think that especially at that age, uh I do feel for girls in high school because they're at the intersections of so much, right?
Yeah.
Negotiating around their own body, negotiating the language around their own autonomy. They're just now realizing their own sexuality, and right at the crux of that, at least for in my experience, I had a lot of older men really hitting on me. The person that I lost my virginity to had no business talking to a high school senior. It was actually
Mm-hmm.
like my mom knew about it, and it was actually very inappropriate. But she also had faith that I could take care of myself, and ultimately I did. I think as
Yeah.
grown up so devoutly religious and grown up in a very deeply religious house, the idea of saving your virtue for marriage was like really important. This idea of like keeping yourself pure for your partner. But none of that really meant anything to me because also it was a thing of why is it that me as the AFAB person in the relationship is expected to keep pure, but the person who's AMAB is not. They're meant to go out there and
Yeah.
get crowns.
Yes.
What sense does that make? Even at 16, 17, I would ask people and no one could give me a proper answer that obviously wasn't steeped in some
Yep.
sort of rule about sexism, right? So
Exactly.
I think I should have known very young. I was a lesbian because there were a lot of heteronormative dynamics that didn't make logical sense to me, and I just did not actively ascribe to. So, for example, in high school, a lot of my girlfriends were like, "Oh, as soon as I'm done with high school, I'm gonna get 2 kids and get a little house, and me and my high school sweetheart are gonna get married." And I'm like, "That's cool, bro. I really want to like travel and like go to all these places I've never been before and try fruits I've never eaten, and hang out with my friends in beautiful cities." Like there was this. Also, I came from a. It was not a small town, but it had small town values, right? You got married as soon as you could out of high school. You settled down as soon as you could, and the idea of having kids. I mean, especially because most of the people I graduated with from high school, a lot of them already have had like 1 or 2 kids.
Mhm.
And the idea of doing that was so unappealing to me. I just kind of was just like, why is this what y'all aspired to? I mean, like, it's okay to aspire for children, but I just reject this notion that your life is incomplete as an AFAB person if you don't have children. And I think indirectly, the idea of me keeping my virginity from the person I wanted to be with was so antiquated and silly to me at 17. I just kind of like wanted to get it out of the way so that way I could like I don't know be better at the actual task, right? And then as for the boyfriend, except for a lot of the people, a lot of the sort of partners, um, are all named whether it's redacted or unredacted, and I very
Mhm.
intentionally put boyfriend because who the person is really is inconsequential to the story, right? It's
Yeah.
rather to show about how I learned about sex and intimacy at the same time that I also learned about power dynamics in relationships because my partner at the time was so much older than me. It wasn't until I was older myself that I realized, oh wait, you were only with me because this was a power grab for you. You were only with me to satiate your own ego. You were only with me because
Mhm.
you could date younger girls and they wouldn't know any better. They wouldn't know
Mhm.
how you say underwhelming he is. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that I don't think I directly address it in Explanando, but those are a lot of the things that the poem is negotiating, right? Sex, intimacy, power, girlhood, all of these things, right? It's bodily autonomy. And in our current socio-political climate, unfortunately, the poem feels more and more apt. I
Yes.
I long for the day where a poem like this eventually becomes antiquated itself. It'll be a long time before we get there, unfortunately.
I love what you just ended with, longing for the day when a poem like this is antiquated itself. And I think that that's also one of the many reasons why Honey exists, why we're also doing this interview, like really putting out into the world, not just this is a poem, but also this is a poem that aspires to, while also looking at this much larger historical context as well. So thank you so much for that really amazing response, Etiola, Asia.
What really resonated with me was the way you were speaking about how the queer trajectory and our goals are just different, especially as like an AFAB person. I feel like goals as a queer AFAB person have always been so dramatically different than what has been narrated
Yeah.
or like paved for us.
Mhm.
Um, and that was really what I got from this piece as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, Asia. I also just yeah, like I said before, like I should have known earlier, but I think also just yeah, I my sensibilities even very young. I'm like, why is it that I gotta put up with this mess just because I'm a woman? That doesn't make any sense. Like, what if I don't want to do that thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that really speaks to my entire experience as well. Um, so our last question, in self-portrait as Etolia, which we were speaking about earlier, the speaker's similes allude to this continuous sacrifice of self-desire and this sacrifice of this reproduction of invisible labor under capitalism, which is something we were just speaking to. Um, and there's an obvious connection between the first line of I tell myself I'm above capitalism and the last line, which is I long for the days when men went to war and never returned. And me and Dorothy were admiring that intertwining of the femme queer experiences of the past, present, and future selves. So we really wanted to talk about tone and lens and the ways that humor and satire can be so underrated within the realm of literature, particularly in queer AFAB literature. And the first and final lines can be read as this burning satire where the speaker is acknowledging and critiquing the system we live under. But we can also laugh about how we're endlessly waiting, for our package to arrive. Um, so we were really hoping to hear about what you think about the role of satire in queer lit as it relates to contemporary queer poets of color and the ways that we grapple with the systems we're living under.
Thank you for that question. I am not naturally a funny poet. I'm very bad at humor on demand. So, especially with that poem and the chapbook as a whole, I was really trying to task myself with talking about these heavy and difficult subjects while also mingling, while also trying to balance it out with some humor. And I'm glad that it worked out. This poem was interesting because it was very much so a last minute decision. This poem, um, I really wanted to. This was my attempt in a lot of ways at a quarantine poem or a pandemic poem, which as a poet myself and as an editor, I'm very averse to reactionary poetry, right? Which is why pandemic appears nowhere in the poem. Rather, it's me renegotiating the domestic space where I'm kind of confined to it, as opposed to it being a source of replenishment, which is often how I view the domestic space. Uh, in terms of how it might be in conversation with other queer poets. I mean, I think I'm always in conversation with Audre Lorde in a lot of ways. Lucy Clifton is not queer though, but in my heart, she's like my other mama, right? I'm also thinking of other poets that I admire who are also queer contemporaries. I'm thinking of Erica Forman, who's also an amazing poet that I admire a lot. Kemi Alabi, who's a brilliant, like, damn, like they are. I feel very fortunate that we are writing at the same time as them because they're so brilliant. Their debut collection is so lush and decadent and exciting. While I was writing that poem, I was also negotiating a relationship that just recently ended. Their name is in there. This is a funny kind of aside to your question, but my ex, who is mentioned in the chapbook, am I allowed to say their name? Should I not say their name?
Up to you.
Oh, yeah, their name is Sean Amin.
Mhm.
For some reason, they brought their fiance with them to my reading while I was in the middle of. I had like a lot of things going on, and then like that night I was going to read. It was my last reading in Madison, and they brought their ex with them for some reason. So I decided to read the poem about them and unredact their name, and it was very liberating for me, in part because it felt like the circle had kind of fully been closed on a lot of what the poem was negotiating, right? This sort of I guess false promise of intimacy, for lack of a better phrasing. Because one of the lines goes, the cherubs grew up like haloing his body hair, his hands tracing the dry want of my mouth. He says, every day I want to wake up and choose you. I say, don't tell me that. Don't promise me that I know this well. And the poem keeps going, right? That same person is also in Queer American with the line, trying to take their internalized homophobia out on my naked body. Sorry, I'm being harassed by people's bodies. But yeah, I think that I really wanted to write a poem that makes these sort of uh, direct notes to capitalism. But because so many poems like that already exist, I felt the only way to do it without taking the poem too seriously was also tempering it with some humor. I think it was really important to have the blend of the two. Otherwise, I feel as though a lot of what the poem was trying to do would have been lost in translation. And yeah, I appreciate what you said, Aja, about Asia. Excuse me. I appreciate what you said, Asia, about the memory and history kind of being both my past and future selves. I never thought of it that way though, but that does actually track when I think about what those things are supposed to do. Um, because I kind of see memory and history at odds with each other, right? Memory is a personal history of the self, but that's not always reliable, right? Because how you remember things is not often how things happen, right? If you think about trauma and how trauma affects the mind, right? And history claims to be an unbiased account of how things happen, but that's not always true.
Yeah.
History is biased by virtue of the person who is the record keeper of history. And all humans are, by virtue of being humans, biased in one way or another, right? So I really, the back and forth that happens between me and these two other figures, which are really just facets of myself, as we sort of move back and forth between these moments that happen in the poem. I was worried initially it would have too much going on, but I think I'm glad that it all kind of worked out and that the poem keeps transforming every time someone else reads it or tells me about it. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Oh, that's just so beautiful. The poem itself transforms every time someone else reads it and interprets it. And
I love
I
that.
love, right? I love to also call that like the endless volta of the poem because as we're writing the poem itself, as poets, right, we're like, we need to like reach for that volta. But at the same time, though, when it is like in the hands of the readers, once the poem is published or at least shared, let's say, amongst a group of people, it is always like transforming itself. And I think another thing I wanted to also point out in your beautiful response, Etiola, was how this poem was created during the pandemic, but you didn't want to create a pandemic poem because you are against reactionary poetry. And I think that that's such a valuable conversation, especially as editors, because I feel the same exact way. Yes, you can create a poem during the pandemic and be remarking on something, but if
Yeah.
you get rid of the word pandemic or any synonym of it, like how does it function as well?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to be teaching a workshop about the domestic space through Brooklyn Poets in October.
Right, right, yeah.
And I'm really fascinated. I mean, I've always been fascinated with the domestic space, right? Especially when I think about Lucia Clifton's work, which is so much grounded in the domestic, right? And how so much of her work informed my own poetics. But I'm also just fascinated with how a lot of us had a really hard time coping during the pandemic because we couldn't make boundaries between our space of
Mm-hmm.
rest and our space of work, right? Our
Mm-hmm.
space of intimacy and our space of maybe machinery, for lack of a better term.
Yep.
Things we have to do to sustain ourselves and things that we do for our living. Um, and so I'm really fascinated with exploring that first site where poems often happen, right? Many of us write our very first poems in the home. We experience our most intimate emotions in the home. And I wanted the poem to reflect that because I have that line. Oh, I never thought I would put it in a poem. That line, I'm lonely, but at least I belong to myself. When I wrote it, I was like, no. I was resisting so much. I was like, oh wait, maybe this is the right impulse because I don't want to do it.
And I thought that I'd also like kind of just tack on one final question
Yeah, of course.
regarding this gorgeous chapbook, Etiola. Um, First of all, like shout out to Newfound. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the process of working with the editors at Newfound and like what your process was like publishing this chapbook as well?
Yeah, I think I said this before that before we started recording that I sent the chapbook out to a lot of places. It was rejected by every place that I sent it out to. My chapbook actually did, fun fact, win a contest. It did actually win the contest, but I withdrew the
Mm-hmm.
chapbook because what was being offered in the contract was not enough for me. Right? It was really important for me to have both physical and digital copies of my chapbooks. I have friends here in the West, but also all over.
Yep.
And it was also really important for me to also have a say in the cover. And my understanding is with that contract, I wouldn't have a say in the cover. And I just refused. So then I sent to Newfound for the Gloria Anzabula Prize. It did not make it to the final round. And then, but I said to myself, I think this is my press. I didn't, I just had a feeling about it. Nothing was really driving the feeling, but I just
Mm-hmm.
had a feeling, this is my press. They're going to publish my chapbook. So I queued them via Twitter and I said, oh, hey, even if your chapbook was rejected, can you send it again? And they were like, yeah. So I scrapped the chapbook I reordered the poems. I added in a bunch of new poems as well. There are like 4 or 5 poems in the chapbook that are not published anywhere that live in the chapbook. And just for me as a poet and also as an editor, I think that's really important. I
Mhm.
love when poets publish good chunks of the book elsewhere, but I also, as a reader, love to get some exclusives. Like, oh, if I buy the book, I'll get like 10 new poems that don't exist anywhere. It makes me as a reader feel special. Like, okay, I get some exclusives. This is great. So it was early December. No, it was late December, early January. Um, Also, just for transparency, I'd had a really like bad and scary end of the year. I was like really brutally depressed, and I didn't really have much hope for the future. And then it kind of felt like getting the email from Crystal felt like a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, okay, you're going through a lot. Yes. Everything sucks, yes, but also your book is getting published. So I
Mhm.
um so Crystal and I talked. We actually had 2 very long phone conversations before I signed any contract because, and you know this, Dorothy, having published chapbooks and also several full lengths. I did not. I feared because I was excited about Newfound and I wanted to sign, but because of what my peers had gone through in the past and stories they had told me, I was apprehensive until I had built a strong enough rapport with my editor that I felt comfortable. Crystal was so good about answering all of my
Mhm.
questions. Sent me a bunch of books from the catalog. She just was like, "Oh, if you want to know what your chapbook's gonna look like, I'll send you a bunch of books." And she didn't have
Yeah.
to do that. And I really love the precedent that they set because um, they gave me a lot of time. I think they gave me like 3 months extra time to sit with my book, and they gave me the opportunity to write more poems that I would not have been able to write otherwise. Um, we went back and forth through multiple revisions because Crystal was like, I want you to look at this chapbook and be totally happy. I want you to get everything that you want. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I didn't know that chapbook presses go this hard for their authors. I got 2 editors who work on the final typeset. 2 very amazing poets in their own right as well, and I just felt so taken care of. We went through multiple iterations of what the cover would look like. I really wanted a deer rotting in a field. A lot of people were like, "Oh, the cover's gorgeous," and then they were like, "What's that?" I'm like, "Oh, it's a deer. Is it? You see his ribs sticking out?" And that's funny for me, right? So before the book cover was revealed, Taylor Swift said, as books had said, "Oh." They were like, they saw the announcement. They're like, "Oh, we can't wait to see the cover so we can support it." And I said to myself, "You're not going to because it's a dead deer." For those little 2 of them, I don't know what kind of covers they promote, and my cover is not that, which is more than fine for me. Um, but yeah, I was really anxious about the cover, but LK James, who drew up the cover, this is so crazy. She had just finished giving birth, and then she was back in the office the next week, and she drew up my
Oh,
cover, and I was like,
wow.
I had no idea until after when Crystal told me, I was just like, yes, what? Thank you. Okay, let me send you. I just yeah, I was She really worked overtime for me, and I'm just so grateful. And I really want all authors to get that experience, that sort of royal treatment. I feel like I got the royal treatment because I got to ask for anything I want, and my press just made it happen.
Mhm.
Like, um, especially for how small the press is, they all work so absurdly hard. Yeah, I love Newfound. They really went above and beyond for me. My first print run went by so fast. Like, it's not even a year my book has been out, and already the first print run is
Yep.
done. And printing. Um, so yeah. Oh, and then I even had to say in the font too, which is what like as someone who's as someone who has typeset books before, the fact that I got to say in the font was a big deal to me. I was like, wow, this is nuts. Crystal showed me different versions of it, and it was really great. I feel very fortunate for that. Yeah,
It is a gorgeous font, you know. You really have like the winner of all fonts, Etiola.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for also sharing like what that process was like. I'm really happy to hear and not surprised that you got the royal treatment, especially because the editors at Newfound do work so hard. Like, what a lovely, lovely team led by Crystal. And thank you so much for spending some time with us today to answer questions about spells of my name. I can't recommend this chapbook enough. And it just like means the world that we're able to connect today. So thank you again.
Thank you both for this. This is great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to see it when it comes out.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm just gonna